to be invited as a guest lecturer. For those individuals who are here, I just put in the chat a little workbook. There's so much is just for information for people to follow. Once the session is over, you can still continue to see that information and make reference to it. And or if you have any additional questions that come from this, you can jot down in the work booklet and we can continue an ongoing dialogue around this conversation. So let me share my screen. Almost there. All right, now I'm seated outside, trying to get into the shade because it's a really nice day out here and it can get a little hot and focus in the sun. So we are going to hold a conversation around equity and social justice, thinking about what does it look like in an educational system designed to produce trauma. The first thing I want to do is at least I want to introduce myself in terms of who I am. I am an educator. I've been in education now, public education now for 3 decades. We talk about 21 of those years, I was in the classroom as a teacher. For 6 years, I taught Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, and Trig. And then for another 15 years, I've been a special education teacher. I taught in the resource classroom and a special day class. By the state of California, I am considered a certified K-12 education specialist. And then for the last 8+ years, I've been an administrator in the Southeast section of San Francisco. In my background, I've always worked at Title I schools, thinking about however that you picture and think about Title I schools. I've always taught in Title I schools, considering the demographics, thinking about as a teacher, I worked in East Oakland and West Oakland, in impoverished communities that had some challenges that came with it. And then when I became an administrator, I was hired to work in the Southeast section of San Francisco, which mimic the same Title I schools and demographics, the community, high teacher turnover, whatever, however you envision the demographics for Title I schools and lower socioeconomic communities. I have always worked in those, whether that has been as an educator in the classroom or now a person who is considered an educational leader. Right? And so what I've come to notice is that the way schools are designed, they're segregated and they're designed to produce trauma. And what I mean by trauma becomes very important when we engage in this conversation around equity and social justice. So what do I mean? When we begin to think about equity for students, there are many definitions around equity. My favorite definition around equity comes from the National Equity Project, and this is their definition. Equity is each student receives what they need to reach their full academic and social potential. When we are engaged in this conversation, as I think about equity and what people are trying to achieve in school systems, whether you happen to be a teacher, social worker, counselor, administrator, somebody working in central office, it should be working towards this particular goal, where each student is receiving what they need to reach their full academic and social potential. But in this conversation for today, I do want to focus in more specifically on teachers, educators. So I took this definition for equity for students within education, and I said, well, educators also need equity, because inside of public education, the things that are happening inside of the system, like teachers are also struggling. Teachers need equity as well. And the definition for equity here is centered around 2 things, just like the previous one was centered around academics and social outcomes. Here it's around instructional capacity and agency. So the definition that we're going to be working with and talking about as we go through this presentation is equity for educators is the following. Each educator receives what they need to reach their full instructional capacity and to exercise agency. And so when I say instructional capacity, not every educator is a teacher. Instructional capacity could also mean whether you're a counselor. There are some things that you're supposed to do at the school site to support students and your colleagues. If you're a social worker, right? If you're a paraeducator, it doesn't make a difference. Anybody that's assigned to a school site has an instructional capacity, and that instructional capacity needs to be developed. So when we think about how we're trained and all of the things that we're exposed to in society as we're growing up, we get acculturated. All right, we are assimilated into a society in which there are certain beliefs and values that we carry. And the next thing you know, we're graduating and we carry those beliefs and values inside of a system. Well, that system also has beliefs and values. And those beliefs and values are all rooted in society. And when we talk about society, we're talking about any and everything that comes with society. We don't get to exclude things. Like, we all live in neighborhoods that have maybe different socioeconomic statuses. We have different beliefs and values. Some people have one parent, two parents. Some people have non-traditional household structures. Some people are in foster care, group homes, whatever the case may be. All of these things we are acculturated and assimilated into, and they reinforce our beliefs and values. And then we walk into a school system. And in those school systems, we clash. Our implicit biases, our explicit biases, they clash because we bring our beliefs and values in, and we really do believe those things and hold them dear to us. But what I believe may not be something that the person who I work with, my collaborative teacher, or the person who might be sitting over discipline, or the person who might be in charge of noontime monitoring, our beliefs and values may clash, but they're clashing within a system that is situated in a context. So what is that context? Before we get into like the schools, in the larger society, we have mental health services being underfunded. This has been a case started in 1981, where Congress began to change and shift funds out of mental health services across the nation. There was a heavier burden placed upon states to provide those mental health services, but that burden, states did not necessarily have the financial means to make up and recover the lost funds for mental health services. So you even saw states deciding to cut back on mental health services. What does that mean? What is the impact? Mental health services cause a significant impact on our communities. We're talking about being able to house those who need mental health services. That was taken away. Being able to identify people at young ages that needed additional mental health services, that was also taken away. So now we have individuals who need supports, and those supports are no longer there. And there are consequences for that inside of our community in which we are raised and have these beliefs and values. Coupled with the reduction in mental health services was a decrease in social programs in the community as well. I can remember as a child when I was coming up that I could go to the park on a Saturday and there would be games all day long starting at 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. Right? We'd just be playing baseball, we'd be playing football, we'd be playing basketballs in gyms. But those programs are cut. Like when I go home to visit now and I go to the park, sometimes on Saturdays, I don't see any games, right? There has been a reduction, not only in mental health services, but in all social programs for children. There's been a heavier burden placed upon cities to come up with funds to try to support and keep kids engaged outside of what we consider school time and also during the summertime. There are consequences for these things inside of our communities. And as those consequences are playing out, relationships are being forged, ideas are being shaped, beliefs and values are being ironed out and prepared to come inside of our school system, where teachers, students, families are now going to come together and somehow collaborate to produce outcomes for students. So now inside of this system, which we also see has some biases, there's accountability, there's segregation inside of our communities, there's underfunding for schools, how do teacher prep programs prepare teachers to lean into and begin to do the work supporting students. We have white supremacy culture, we have disproportionality, we have compliance, traditional slavery complex. All of these things are inside a school system, and teachers are now told, when I say teachers, I'm including everybody, counselors, social workers, administrators, teachers are now told that they have to produce outcomes, and that these outcomes have to be such that students are improving, teachers are improving, and your school scores are going up, so that when they put it on some dashboard or when some parent does a search for your school, that school will have improved data, so that parents would then want to select that school as a choice school to attend. So in the midst of all of this, where there's this pressure, there's this increased accountability, there's an expectation for teachers to do these things. There's an expectation for teachers to improve outcomes, right? Well, how are you supposed to achieve these things when you're underfunded? How are you supposed to achieve these things when you don't have all of the resources required to do that? How are you supposed to achieve these things when collaboration is not valued or is not prioritized through time? How are you supposed to achieve these things if there's conflict between the administrators and the teachers? Like there's this us versus them conflict. How is this supposed to occur when there aren't conversations across systems around transforming and changing our dialogue and communication working conditions so that we could be on the same page and get outcomes? Well, since those things aren't occurring inside of school, we are ripe for trauma. And trauma, we're thinking about trauma being in three types, right? And when we start thinking about these three types of trauma that impact us, where we have acute trauma, which occurs with a single distressing event. We actually have chronic trauma, which is exposure to multiple long-term and prolonged distressing events over an extended period of time. Or we have complex trauma, which is varied in multiple distressing events within the context of interpersonal relationships. So when you begin to think about what we're looking at right now, right? The way the system is designed, school system is designed based upon underfunding and increased accountability and programs that don't align to the specific needs of the students and teachers inside the building, you have a system that is ripe for producing acute, chronic, and complex trauma. And that is what we are seeing inside of schools, right? When you look at articles that are being written all across this nation, we're talking about disproportionality, we're talking about the opportunity gap. But when you begin to read these things, like, don't think about them in terms of an intellectual reading or an intellectual understanding. When you read about the opportunity gap, you should be thinking in terms of, well, what are the relationship like between the students and the teacher inside a room where the opportunity gap is existing and living? What are relationships like inside the classroom, inside the building, between students and teachers when we talk about disproportionality and referrals and suspensions? The conversation, if the conversation is based upon things that we read in the newspapers, these conversations tend to remove us from what is actually happening inside the classrooms, from what is actually happening inside the buildings. And inside the buildings, the opportunity gap, the disproportionality, the school to prison pipeline, whatever you want to call it, we are now talking about an environment where acute, chronic, and complex trauma is occurring on a regular basis. Who's going to address that? More times than not, when we talk about disproportionality, we talk about the opportunity gaps, people tend to use this phrasing now what they call student-centered. right? Student-centered is a buzzword, it's a catchphrase. And, I'm for student-centered, but what does student-centered really mean? Can you be student-centered and not support teachers? Can you be a student-centered individual, a student-centered school site, a student-centered district, a student-centered state, when you don't provide the necessary funds for the teachers who are in the classrooms, who are in the counseling offices, who deal with the parents? If you don't provide them with the funds and necessary resources to do this work, can you be student-centered? Like, that is a question that people aren't asking, right? When we are trying to get these equitable outcomes. Well, I'm saying that the system, the way it's designed, it is actually producing trauma for educators inside the building: acute, chronic, and complex. And how do we know? Well, we could take a look at this diagram. Comes from the National Equity Project. It's called the Lens of Systemic Oppression. And in this diagram, what you see that this is a Venn diagram, you see intersecting circles. You have the individual, that's one area within this diagram. You have the interpersonal, and then you have a third section that deals with the institutional or the structural. Within this system, right, we can see how individuals, we're talking about whether you're a parent, student, teacher, counselor, social worker, it doesn't make a difference. We're talking about individuals who are bringing their personal beliefs and actions into the school system. They come with all kinds of biases, explicit biases. Whether you're a student, parent, educator, you're bringing those into the building. And then what happens inside of those buildings is instruction is supposed to take place, right? And when you go back to think about equity for students, there's the academic piece and then there's a social piece. Well, inside of the classroom, where instruction is taking place, what tends to happen is you have rules and regulations that deal with protocols, procedures for getting pencils, for getting access to the floor, for going to the bathroom, for engaging in conversations when they're group work, what's supposed to happen when you're doing independent work. There's this interaction. And when there are behaviors that don't conform with the expectations to those interactions, adults respond, right? And so adults respond in ways that are rooted in their beliefs and values. And when adults do respond, some students tend to respond back. And so then we have this clash, right? And so what happens when this clash occurs, of course, is the adult, we can just send the kid out. We can write a referral, disrupt in the classroom, and you're sent out. And here begins the relationship between the connection between the student and the teacher, and the opportunity gap and disproportionality, right? What is happening inside the classrooms. And then the student is sent out, and the student goes down to whatever counseling department, and they say they don't have restorative practices. What tends to happen then is the adults down there in processing, you tend to tell the student, this is what you did, this is the consequence, you're either suspended, much time to detention. And there's this further disconnect and distancing with the child, the student in this term, in this case, and what the school is trying to achieve. And if this happens on a regular basis for that particular student or particular students, this is where we end up getting the opportunity gap, right? We get the disproportionality. Well, then how do we address those things? Who is responsible for addressing those things? Because over time, where we start talking about teacher trauma comes in the interactions with the students inside the classroom when you're just trying to teach content and you're constantly dealing with inappropriate behavior. Well, who's supposed to deal with that, right? Because at the end of the year, if you have enough opportunities to deal with that particular behavior in class, it interrupts your teaching. And so then other students don't have an opportunity to engage in instruction over a period of time. So we end up having to make a choice. Do we address the student who is showing inappropriate behavior, or do we support the students who are showing appropriate behavior? And I'm here to say that that's a false choice, right? That you can design a system to support everybody, the educator, the student demonstrating inappropriate behavior and the students who are doing what we expect them to do as far as appropriate behavior. But the way the system is designed, if you're not aware of those choices, it's hard for you to advocate for them. And we tend to default to what we've done previously. And this is why you can look across this nation and we have issues around suspensions and referrals. So much so here in the state of California, California Education Code, they removed suspending Black students for willful defiance. Now, that's on the surface level, that's great, right? Because willful defiance is how people were, they were using that particular suspension code to suspend Black students. But nobody asked the question, okay, you can remove willful defiance, but what is happening inside the building with the relationship between educators and Black students, right? This is where the meat of the problem is. This is where we have to address the issue. And how do you address those issues? Who has the answer? Who is doing the work to deal with that? And what we find out is that people are struggling. You can pick any state, any district within a particular state. And if you have Black and brown students, you're going to find that there's a problem around discipline, that there's a problem around instruction. And the question becomes, what is going on? Why can't we solve this issue that is running across the nation? When I say it's across the nation, I just saw, was it about 3-4 weeks ago, there's an article on what was going on in Cincinnati public schools, right? I also read just before the summer hit, the LA Unified had determined that educating Black students was such a challenge that they actually allocated $36.5 million just for educating Black students in LA Unified School District because they saw that they weren't meeting the needs. You come here to Oakland. Oakland just passed a bill, their Oakland Public Schools, where it's $10 million allocated to try to educate Black students. And then in Compton Unified, what we have is there were students and parents and teachers that filed a lawsuit against Compton Unified School District. And why they filed a lawsuit? Kids who were in Compton, the city of Compton, were being exposed to things that kids shouldn't be exposed to. And this was a traumatic event, and it's something that's been ongoing. And then those kids would come to Compton Unified Schools, and in schools, they would be triggered, and the trauma that they'd exposed would be playing out inside of classrooms. And instead of addressing the trauma, what ended up happening is the students were referred out of classrooms and then suspended. And the lawsuit decided to say, hey, look, you can't keep doing this to kids. The schools have to address trauma. Okay, yes, I agree schools have to address trauma, but in this situation, the thing that we're talking about is who is getting the vicarious trauma? It's the trauma that's being transferred. It's the teachers. How do we support the teachers in addressing things that are occurring in our classroom? Because the teachers, as they deal with the trauma that's occurring in our classrooms, they are being traumatized. It's the acute trauma, right? It's the chronic trauma. It's the complex trauma that teachers are being exposed to, right? And why is this occurring? Because there has been a decrease in funding, not only for mental health services, but for social programs. And there's also something that is creeped in that was different in my time than it is now. When I was coming up as a child in the 70s, there was like this community vibe where if I was out somewhere doing something and a neighbor could see me, and a neighbor could actually approach me and tell me to stop doing that behavior, right? Chastise me and send me home, and then say that I'm going to tell your mother that I saw you out there doing this, right? Well, we now live in a time where you can't do that. Like parents will tell you mind your business, kids will tell you to mind your business. We are less of a community than we were back then. And because we are less of a community, when it comes to solving problems, it becomes more challenging because any issue inside of education that needs to be solved, if it is not rooted in a community context, you're going to have some significant challenges. And so what happens is, since we don't have the community context, the trauma that students are being exposed to and playing out triggered inside the classrooms, and the trauma that teachers are being exposed to, triggered, playing out in classrooms and in counseling offices, counseling departments. It's not being addressed. And over time, you get burnout. But what do school districts do? They take a look at data, and they're being asked to change the data. And instead of providing the resources so that the adults in the building, the educators in the building, can begin to address the issues, at least at the level at which they can, as far as education is concerned, instead of saying we're going to give them resources, what the system has done has actually blamed teachers, right? So teachers are seen as the problem. And so if you look here, I do have some examples of people talking about US schools are underfunded by nearly $150 billion annually, right? What could schools do with an additional $150 billion if they are trying to educate kids? Well, there are consequences for that money not being there, right? Not having enough adults in the building, right? Not having the resources to do the things that you feel that you need to do to address the trauma that's actually occurring inside the building, right? And because it's underfunded and people can't do it, can't address the issues because of not having enough funds, and teachers get blamed, right? There's an additional stressor that is now added to the job, because now you feel that you're inadequate, or educators feel that they're inadequate to address the needs. Well, blame is good. Like, people want to shift it around. So maybe it's not the teacher's fault, right? Maybe it's somebody else's fault. Whose fault could it be? Well, I put another picture in here that talks about 68% of the polls say it's the parents' fault, not the teachers. So when we begin to think about this, like, this is amazing. When you begin to think about outcomes in school not meeting standards or not improving based upon desired outcomes, that we can default to blaming teachers, we can default to blaming parents, we can default to blaming administrators, but nobody is looking at the system, which is actually underfunding schools, reducing support for mental health services and social programs, and not providing a living wage for not just people inside the community, but in situations like I work in San Francisco, a teacher's salary is not even sufficient in order for you to rent an apartment, right? Where you can actually have an apartment on your own and live. Living wage has become a problem. So there are so many factors that are going into this system, and it's actually producing trauma for adults. So then when we begin to think about trying to make adjustments, trying to make changes, if we're going to make that happen, we need to actually have a framework and understand where things are occurring. And if we understand where things are occurring, then we can begin to address those issues. So let's take a look here. So we know about the implicit biases that exist inside of our own development, right? And I'll give you an example of implicit biases. As a young man, I was engaged in a lot of physical altercations. I did a lot of crazy things, right? And so when I became a principal and I was sitting over referrals, if a kid was sent out for inappropriate behavior, I had a particular view of children that was it's not aligned to my teachers. My teachers felt that there should be some type of, what they say, fire and brimstone. Like, I should be putting the fear of God into students when they're sent out, right? And then my take on it was like, no, I should be rebuilding kids to repair them so they can go back into the classroom and have skills to cope and be part of the content class and instruction. All right. Well, there was a clash between teachers and I. Well, why was that clash occurring? Well, because we had different beliefs and values based upon our experiences. So as those things play out, teachers have feelings, other educators have feelings around this, right? But we still continue. So here's what happens. This is where the oppression occurs, where the institutions and the structures that support student and teacher relationships, they are the referees. What's good, what's bad, what's fair, what's not fair. And so students feel and parents feel that schools are wrong when the system supports a teacher's position when it comes to consequences or academics related to their children. The teachers feel and the educators feel oppressed when the administration does not support a decision that occurred in the classroom and or in the counseling department. So what we tend to have here is trauma. And trauma is being manifested time and time again, not only by the incidents that are occurring inside the classroom and in the counseling department, but then by the decisions made by the people who are in positions of power, right? So then how do we transform that? How do we change that, right? What is the step that's going to allow us to be different? So here's what we need to do. In any school site, which is something that occurred at my school site, we prioritize the student and teacher relationship. And with the priority of that relationship, all resources, all training, and all funding have to move towards supporting that. So anybody inside the building that was not a content teacher, their job was literally to support the student and teacher relationship inside the classroom at all times, right? Based upon some agreements. Now, you can't just say we're going to support because the teachers had some beliefs and values sometimes that clash with the student values, right? And there's sometimes the things that adults value, they were not appropriate and they should not have been used to enforce those rules. So then what systems do you have to put in place to address those things? So we have to come up with those things, right? So we would do things like inside the interpersonal, dropping things called student rights. You have to have student rights. Student rights are what govern the relationship between adults and students inside the building, inside the classroom, inside the counseling department. If you interact with the principal, student rights is the thing, right? And so we actually implemented student rights and then supported teachers around their professional development to implement and use teaching strategies, pedagogies around this that allow them to produce a safe and learning environment. And what we found over time is that when we began to support teachers build their capacity to do a variety of things, we were able to change outcomes. But only change outcomes, remember there are two things for teacher educator equity, right? It's the building the instructional capacity, but then there's also agency. Inside of our building, what we ended up doing was we ended up allowing teachers, the educators in the building, to build their own profession, their PDs, so that PDs were based upon the needs of the people inside the building. And when we did that and gave some ownership over that, well, we began to see over time, one, that not only did our capacity to do the word change, but then two, teachers were feeling better about their jobs. Teachers were feeling better around, teachers were having more efficacy inside of their classroom and more agency inside of the building. And what began to happen is the environment changed not only for students, but it also changed for educators and it also changed for parents. Well, what were some of those things that we specifically did? Well, when it's in your work booklet, we focus on a community school strategy, which I'm not going to necessarily go into. Community school strategy, healing center practices, and we resisted the notion of us versus them. When I say us versus them, there's no teacher versus student. There's no teacher versus administrator. There's no parent versus teacher or parent versus administrator. There's just us. We are one community. And community schools, the community school strategy helps do that. Healing center practices, and we resisted this us versus them. So when we looked at being trauma informed when it comes to adults and when it comes to students, we came up with, there were three things that really helped us become trauma informed, and we call them the 3 A's. They were agency, advocacy, and acceleration. And we noticed that when we emphasize agency, where we were giving adults, educators in the building, choice and control over their learning environment, right? When we were allowing them to advocate for other colleagues, advocate for students, and responding to that advocacy. When we focus in on acceleration and focus in on adult learning specifically tied to their needs inside the building, we began to see some changes, right? And so what are those changes? When you look at
Can I
the
pause you for
wheel,
1 minute, Michael? See
yes,
if
ma'am.
people have questions, because I think you just shared such a wealth of information.
Thank you. And
But
please
I
forgive me.
want
I was, yeah.
No, you
And
are.
yeah,
I
let me
mean, you've
stop
got so
sharing. Let me
much to
stop
share
sharing.
with us. So, no, you can keep the screen on if you want, but if anyone has questions, I know Polly put a question in about resources and supports for families and questions about the pandemic. Anyone else have a question for Michael as he's shared a bunch of strategies so far? Okay. I see Laurel asked, what are some first action steps if a public middle school wants to become a community school? Because you talk about the social supports that are needed.
Right. There are a few things that need to occur. One, you need to find out if your district has community schools or believes in community schools. If your district has a community school strategy, then you need to find out if they have resources for um, community schooling. And if not, then the question becomes, how do you then find in your budget where you can, well, you have to do things. One, find in your budget where you can potentially hire somebody who's a community school, or advocate at the district level to produce monies to do community schooling. Community schooling as a strategy, when you begin to think about all the things that are occurring with students and in families in the community, that when you have a person who is a student who's enrolled in a school, you don't have a student, you actually have a family that's enrolled in that school. So if that student at home is not eating on a consistent basis, what you have inside of your classes is a kid that's hungry. And then if a kid is hungry, the kid can't focus on content. If that kid is part of a family that's couch surfing, where there's housing insecurity, right? Then there could be a disruption in consistent sleep pattern. So then you might have a kid sitting in your room who's sleepy and hungry, right? So with community schooling, you actually have an individual, a community school coordinator, who's able to do a needs assessment to address a wide variety of issues inside of your community, and then partner with agencies during the day to support students, teachers, and families to meet those needs that have been identified. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Yeah. Michael, on top of the traumas you mentioned, we also had the pandemic this year, and I know you held your school together very well through all the roller coaster ride that was this school year. Did you want to share how that impacted this work? Were you continuing to give teachers agency? How was that?
Yes. So this year was very interesting, right? And this is where you begin to see the trauma and how trauma plays out. So at my school site, my teachers have always had agency. Distributed leadership is like a really big thing at my school site. Well, when we went to the pandemic, when school buildings were closed, what's important, and this is how, like, I had to understand this as a person who was the leader, the principal of the school. Our school site is so heavily focused in on relationships between students and teachers. It really is the strength of my school site. When the building is now closed, the trauma that is triggered for the adults in the building, right? Of course, like, I'm not saying that students weren't traumatized. The trauma for the adults in the building who had these strong relationships, it was significant. And my teachers really struggled. And the things that the teachers really struggled with, it was kids having their cameras turned off, right? They didn't feel like they were connecting with students. And the biggest thing that we had at the school site, not only are we community school, but we do project-based learning, we do restorative practices, we do a variety of things that were so important. Now, proximity didn't allow that to occur. And my teachers really struggled with that lack of proximity to support students. Because what our teachers did know is that what our students needed as far as support, those things were still needed during the pandemic, and then they couldn't provide it. They couldn't provide the safe space for lunchtime, right, or after school. They couldn't do the running clubs with them. They couldn't do the flag football, right? They couldn't set up those times in which they walk 2, 3 blocks away to go buy boba tea, to sit and process things with children. All those things were removed. And my teachers struggle with that. And they struggle with doing PD, right? And so what happened to me initially, I got upset. I was really bothered. It's like, hey, we're still doing school, we're still doing this, we're still that. Then I had to pause thinking about the systems of oppression. I could not become that person who was trying to do some of the things that the district was saying I needed to do in order to make sure teachers still acted like it was school. We are in a community. So then I had to pause, and we shifted to do a variety of things around empathetic listening for teachers in terms of what's going on, and then asking them what do they need at this particular moment in time. And then as a site administrator, I had to buffer. There's some things that I needed to do to support my teachers by buffering from central office around some ideas. But the one thing that did allow my teachers to feel some sense of agency and advocacy during this time was, I have a community school coordinator, and what she ended up doing as soon as the buildings were closed, we used the way I designed the master schedule, like as by homeroom, those groups moved throughout the day together. My community school coordinator designed a way to check in with all parents through homeroom. And we had this document that there were some questions like, how's your food situation, housing situation? Is there anything else we need to know? And so we were able to collect a ton of information on all of our families, all of our students, whether you need a Wi-Fi, laptop, et cetera. And then we began to meet the needs, right? We raised over $15,000 and provided gift cards. And then word got out to the district that this was happening. And this was happening because I had a community school coordinator. I can tell you right now, I didn't sit down and come up with this as a brilliant principal and came up with these ideas. Because we're a community school, my community school coordinator came up with that. And our families responded well. Not only did we deliver food, gift cards so that they can buy groceries, but there were other things like people needed cleaning supplies, like we delivered bleach, Lysol, and a variety of things of that nature. The district ended up requiring all schools in our entire district to do what my community school coordinator did, right? And so now everybody's doing it, but they weren't community schools. So the question becomes, like, how could everybody become a community school, right? So my teachers felt some advocacy around that because they felt like they were doing something, once again, because they were getting information, they were now connected to the needs, and then passing on the information for us as a school to then respond to those needs of our students and families. If you guys ever get the opportunity to look up Leslie Hu, H-U, if she pops up anywhere in the system, she is my community school coordinator, and she is amazing. Everybody should have a Leslie.
Any other questions for Michael in this time?
How can we get that lesson, Michael?
I think they're doing some cloning now, right? We got to look into cloning, but I don't know how expensive it is right now.
Yeah. I know you had a few more slides, Michael. I saw you shared the trauma stewardship, and I know that's been some work that we're working on in building the capacity of our educators so they can continue.
Okay, well, I will.
Whatever.
I will return briefly to that, because in the end, what I want to say is this: we're so overwhelmed with data that's negative, right? These kids need to improve their reading. Discipline is a problem. You're a problem because you're disciplining kids. Well, why aren't the kids improving their academic outcomes? Then there must be something wrong with your content. We need administrators to do some observations and get in there, and you need to tell those teachers what they need to do, right? We just need to hit the pause button on all of that, right? And when I say hit the pause button, if we are going to address any situation, the question becomes, what does the community need in order to achieve outcomes? And accountability is not the first thing that you should be talking about if you're trying to achieve outcomes, especially in a system that is underfunded, right? A system that we do not have the required resources at the school site to do the work. By hitting pause, it allows you to then begin to think about, what do students need at the school site? And based upon what students need, what do teachers need to be able to do in order to address the needs of the students? And then what role, because people at different levels as an administrator, what is my role after I identify the needs of the student and what the teacher needs are? How do I support my students and teachers with the budget? How do I support my students and teachers with the decisions that I make at the school site? How do I support my students and teachers with what I buffer them from the district level? These things are important because when I talk about agency, advocacy, and acceleration, that's for everybody in the system. So I'm going to lean it just on advocacy. Everybody has, if you're part of the community, everybody in the community needs to be advocating for everybody else in the community. Because as soon as you start to blame, you begin to tear your community apart. And so, like, even reframing and redesigning. So we have low reading scores. It's not about, the people in the humanities department, the people to teach English, you guys are doing poor instruction. It's like, nope, we have low reading scores. All right, why do we have low reading scores? And what's an asset in our community that is supporting something around reading? And then how do we strengthen that, right? Like, that is a different conversation than saying, I'm going to walk into the classroom and I'm going to see where you're wrong around your reading. I'm going to give you as an administrator, I'm going to give you some information around what you need to do to improve. And if you don't do those things, I'm going to give you a bad evaluation, right? What I know for a fact, looking at the data, that our reading scores at the middle school level are connected to insufficient support for the elementary school teachers who are teaching kids who need all kinds of supports, right? And so then how am I going to blame my teachers for not being able to take on and address the systemic issue that's coming from elementary school teachers not being supported, right? You really do have to think in terms of advocacy. So I would say that. But the other piece is, one of the things that I rejected as a site leader is I rejected this whole trickle down training, where you send 2 to 3 people from your school site to be trained, and then they come back to your school, and then your school is considered trained. That has to be completely rejected. You need whole school training. Everybody needs to be trained simultaneously and or in pieces before you implement anything. Without whole school training, what tends to happen is not only certain students and teachers will get resources and training that are beneficial, but that is not distributed across, and that is not equity. Going back to our definition of equity, if each student is supposed to receive what they need to reach their full academic and social potential, if it's good in one class, it should be good across all classes. So high leverage, because you can't do whole school training on everything. High leverage. What is the 1 or 2 things that you say a school site needs to say? We need whole school training across this. And if we have whole school training across this, it's going to benefit students, it's going to benefit teachers. So when I go back to, we'll go back to sharing the slide, and then I will stop.
We got a little reverb.
I heard that. I don't know where that's coming from. All right, here we go. All right, so when we start looking at the trauma, all right, a sense that one can never do enough, that comes from a lack of support. Like, teachers feel isolated, educators feel isolated. And when you start leaning into this accountability conversation, all right, these things automatically kick into place, right? Deliberately avoid administrators, because administrators have problems in terms of looking at, people have problems with administrators coming in to look at how you're teaching or relationships and giving you feedback that people might perceive as negative. There's fear, there's guilt. My teachers feel so bad around outcomes, and those outcomes are not necessarily connected to specifically what they're doing in the classroom. When you have over 70% of students in a school that are not reading on grade level, whose fault is that, right? There's a system that is producing kids at the middle school level where we're having 70% of our kids are not reading on grade level. That is a problem. And it's not a data point, I'm not talking about the data point. I'm talking about then what are the consequences for teachers in classrooms where you have these 70% of students who are not reading on grade level and they have to teach content. They have to keep the pace for the pacing guide, right? They have these lessons that are designed, but you're sitting in a heterogeneous classroom with reading levels anywhere from the second grade to the ninth grade in a sixth grade science class. That is overwhelming. When we go back into that acute, chronic, right, and complex trauma, these are the things that are happening to teachers. And so how do you support teachers in addressing that? That has to come from a systems approach, because if we don't have a systems approach, the trauma that educators in the building will experience, it will be annual. Sometimes it will be daily, right? Sometimes it'll be every time you have to produce report cards. The impact on a teacher seeing that you have to give out the number of D's and F's, nobody ever thinks about, well, what does that feel like for a teacher who has to do that? Well, I'm saying if we're a community, that has to be factored in. What is happening to teachers who have to give those D's and F's? What happened to the students in the classrooms who are receiving those D's and F's? What's happening to the parents who are receiving information that students are receiving the D's and F's? And then how do we heal and address all of those issues? That has to come from a systems perspective. And when we start talking about a systems perspective, the systems perspective, I say a rising tide lifts all boats. If we can do a system training across around a variety of things like my school site push-in services and or student rights, when we implement those things and are implemented well with fidelity, that's going to benefit everybody and it changes outcomes. But more times than not, and I'll stop sharing, people don't connect their decisions around professional development. They don't connect them to trauma or decreasing trauma or addressing the issues, because the issues that educators face that are considered traumatic, it is their interpersonal relationships, not only with students, but with parents and administrators and their colleagues on a regular basis. That cycle has to be interrupted based upon the decisions we make. And those decisions have to be around whole school training and high leverage situations that are going to benefit the relationship between students and teachers. I'll stop there if there are any questions.
Feels like you came full circle. Thank you so much, Michael. Do people have questions or comments or responses?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
This is Greg Jennings. Michael, thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much for pouring your heart out. I can see your heart right now, so thank you for that. And my question was, I like the 3 A's, and I was curious what an example of acceleration would look like in the context. I got the first two, but I'm still trying to get a sense of what acceleration would look like.
Acceleration is learning. Great question. First of all, thank you for the question. Acceleration is learning. So I'll allocate money every year in my budget set aside to pay for teachers to go to any professional development they want to. I had a science teacher that approached me and said, hey, I want to go to X, Y, and Z. It's in Houston. It's like, I got it. Just like when you go, there's some things you're gonna have to do when you return. So I paid for him to go to this training. I had a teacher that was, she supports the student body, and she wanted to go to a conference that dealt with how to support student bodies. It was a national conference. Well, the teacher wanted to do that to improve her ability to lead in the student body. Well, you have to have money to do that. I have money allocated, and I paid for her to actually do that. Acceleration is around being able to support any adult improving their capacity to do what we need to do at the school site. And some of that comes in the form of professional development at the school site, where my teachers actually control the professional development that's connected to what they need. Then our PDs become acceleration for teacher capacity, building teacher, counselor, and administrator capacity at the school site.
Thank you.
All right.
We have time for one last question. This session is recorded, so we'll have it available on we have a YouTube channel with all our guest lectures on it. Dr. Greg Jennings has a great one on collective well-being as well. So any last questions for Michael?
Sure. Can I ask one?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just wondered if you had any academic research further reading that you would suggest, either about trauma, like complex trauma, or systems? You know, because I'm interested in a deeper understanding in some of these things. And then also, so completely unrelated, I also wondered what was available later, because I unfortunately missed some of your talk. So I'll listen. Thank you.
Okay. So one, I can generate a list. I have a long list of things that I use over my years. I've been in education now for 3 decades. I can generate a list for you around trauma and actually supporting people. But I'm also going to lean in. There aren't a lot of books that deal with what I am about to say. And the biggest trauma that I see inside of schools is a relationship between the administrator and teachers, right? That relationship is usually very toxic. And so thinking about like a big resource is like Zaretta's book around culture responsive teaching in the brain, but how I'm viewing it's not the book itself where it's about teachers teaching in the classroom, but if I'm an administrator that's going to be doing any type of observation, then how do I set my observation based upon the culturally responsive teaching that the teacher's trying to do and give feedback around what the teacher's attempting to do? And then how do I set the PD around what the teacher's attempting to do, as opposed to me coming in as an administrator and doing something completely different and evaluating them on something totally separate? That produces real trauma for teachers inside the classroom setting. And I do think that that is the biggest issue, is that the role of administrators in producing systemic oppression or supporting systemic oppression at the school site. But I can definitely get you all kinds of books around trauma. That's not going to be an issue. I'll send it to you, Emily, and you can provide it to the participants.
And in the end right here, I do want to mention you are doing anti-racist discipline trainings. You just spoke at the Dismantling White Supremacy Conference, and you have your ongoing trainings with the Essien Education Group, right, Michael? If you
Absolutely. So, in fact,
yeah,
I just put it. It's in your work booklet if people are interested. I'm really into systems changing, and so one of the biggest things that we did at my school site to transform all things was we create this thing called push-in services. So I offer a training around push-in services. That's the thing that KQED and NPR went national and international around how to transform the relationship between students and teachers inside content classes. That's push-in services. And I do anti-racist discipline. It's attached to my blog is in there also. But anti-racist discipline is not, it's around how do we adjust the system so that we can remove the predictability, the racial predictability of outcomes. So anti-racist is around removing the racial predictability of data, right? And so I provide trainings on that. I've now done 3 series of trainings on that. So it's what I like to do. I love education, and I believe in transforming outcomes, especially for teachers who are responsible for students, because students and teachers are 2 sides of the same coin. You can't be student-centered if you're not teacher-centered. You can't be teacher-centered if you're not student-centered.
thank you so much. And Michael and I collaborate in our supervision groups, and we just wanted to share that our trauma-informed specialist program has a 10-month program, and our next one starts August 21st, and we have 5 more spots. So I know there's some people that have graduated from the program that are here, and Dr. Jennings is our advisor. So thank you all for attending this session. We really appreciate it. I'll stay on for another minute or so, but appreciate you all being here at the start of your summer. So, nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys be well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
so
You as
much.
well.
Really informative. Thank you very much for giving me this talk.
Take care.
All right.
Emily?
Yeah.
Well, appreciate
thanks,
you.
Michael. Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me.